We have one person who grew up in a refugee camp as our guest. He's now a refugee advocate. He is studying outside of the country. Nhial Deng, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Karibu sana, and thank you for joining us.
Asante.
You have a story to tell, and there are very many stories that you are going to tell us. And then, in the work that you're doing now, at the point where you are in university and you have been able to understand and look at your situation and the situation of many like you, what is it that you'd like to see going forward? We'd like to hear your story on that. But before that, let's get today's quote. Janet is going to give you a quote. Somebody said something somewhere at some point, and then Janet is going to tell us who that was, what they said, why they said it, and let's hear your reflection on that.
Right. Warsan Shire, a British Somali poet, wrote a poignant, powerful poem called Home. I'll probably read it at the end of this hour, hopefully, while Nhial is still with us. But right now, the quote that I want to share is, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." How does that land with you, Nhial? And even as you talk to us about it, you can also tell us why and when you left home. But you can start with reflecting on, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark.
Thank you so much, Janet, for sharing that very powerful quote. I've come across it many times, and I think, honestly, in many ways, it captured the entire situation of being a refugee, right? Many people do not leave home by choice. And, it's surprising sometimes that not many people know it, because refugees often turn into political football. The way refugees are portrayed in the media or by a politician is very different to the realities, right? Many people leave home because there's no other choice. You either have to leave or you have to die, or, the situation is worse and the only option is leaving home. And for me, I left home when I was 11 years old. I was living in Ethiopia. My dad actually fled South Sudan first and moved to Ethiopia many years ago, where I was born. And my village in Ethiopia was attacked by armed militia in 2010. It was early in the morning at 4 a.m. My dad woke me up. I had gunshot. I had people screaming. And my dad told me, "You had to leave." And I came outside and I saw my entire village being burned down. And then my dad, sent me with a group of women and children mostly, and some men to, flee the village. My dad had to remain behind to fight and to try to protect our village. And that's how I found myself in Kenya after a very traumatizing 2-week journey. And then I ended up in Kakuma refugee camp at age 11 by myself with just 2 families from my village in Ethiopia.
Who were the family members that you came with?
They were, one of the family members that I came with was, a neighbor living next to us. So my mom and my younger sibling were living in a different village in Ethiopia. So me and my dad were in Itang because my dad wanted me to go to school. Itang is a bigger town. So they were relatives that were living closer in Itang, Ethiopia.
So at age 11, you're in Kenya, a new country. You're in a refugee camp. You're not here with your mother or your father. You're here with neighbors from a village that you are in a country that's not originally even your home.
Yeah.
Good Lord. Okay, then what?
So I think, for me, the turning point was when I started going to school. Growing up as a kid, my dream was actually to be a journalist, because my dad used to listen to the radio, and I would come back from school. I was sitting next to him, listening to the radio, listening to the news. He's a storyteller and would tell me, about South Sudan. My dream was honestly always to go back to South Sudan, because I really want to see my country. When I get to Kakuma refugee camp, I remember I was traumatized. I don't know when I'll get a chance to see my family again, my dad, my mom, my 2 younger siblings. I spent 4 weeks in the camp, and then I spent 4 months in the camp. The 5th month, I was able to be sent back to school in Kakuma refugee camp. And I think that was the turning point for me. I remember education gave me more than just learning. It gave me a place to heal. It gave me a place of solace. And I started thinking about a glowing future again. As a kid, my dad told me I need to go to school and good English, go to the UK and work for BBC. That was my dream. So I remember when I went to school, I asked my English teacher, how can I learn good English? And she told me you need to write a lot. And I think for me, that really changed a lot. And I started dreaming about a better future again. And I continued my education at the camp.
So you were at the camp?
Yeah.
Primary school at Kakuma refugee camp?
Yeah.
And then secondary school?
Kakuma refugee camp as well.
All the way to Form 4?
All the way to Form 4, yeah. I did my KCSE in the camp.
Okay. What was your state at this point? Were you a Kenyan as you're sitting your KCPE and KCSE? Do you have an ID? Do you have any registration? Of course, you don't have an ID. You're younger, below. No, you came to Kenya at the age of 11. So by the time you're doing Form 4, you're over 18.
Yeah.
Do you have an ID? Are you registering as a Kenyan student? Are you, in what state are you?
Right.
Yeah, so basically, as you know, the Kenyan government worked very closely with the UN to manage the refugee situation in Kenya. Kenya now hosts close to 1 million refugees, I think over 800,000 refugees the last time I checked. So they do not get Kenyan citizenship. They get a refugee identification card that allow you to access basic services in the camp, for example, education, accessing shelter, accessing healthcare. So that is the form of ID card that I had. And the Kenyan government worked very closely with the UN, so refugees are allowed to be able to register using their refugee ID card for the national examination, including KCP and KCSE. And that is how I ended up doing my my KCP and KCSE in the camp.
Right. After that, when your results come out, next thing you know is now looking for higher education. What does that look like?
It's very challenging. I think now looking at figures, of course, most of the refugees around the world are young people, and access to education is very, very limited, especially tertiary education. Until very recently, there were actually no university at all in Kakuma refugee camp. Now there are a number of universities that have branches in Kakuma, including Masina Muliro University in collaboration with the UN. But after I finished my high school, I applied for a number of scholarship program, and I did not get any in the first year. So I was like, okay, let's wait and see. But when I was in high school, I started, getting involved in community work. I was a student leader, and when I finished high school, I was like, okay, maybe I should continue doing this work. So I did a bit of that, doing a lot of advocacy. I created social media account to talk about refugees and the challenges that refugees were facing. And my story started going around the world, and I started receiving invitation to speak at conferences around the world about challenges that face refugees in Kakuma refugee camp. And then in 2020, I started applying for a scholarship to go abroad, and that's how I ended up in Canada.
Right.
Okay. The theme, I'll come to that. I just want to know, because refugees have been here for decades, I'm curious to find out whether things are moving backwards or forwards, obviously shrinking protections and a lot of other issues. But first, take us through the daily struggles that some would deal with in a refugee camp, whether it's access to healthcare, beyond food and shelter. What are the daily struggles?
I always tell people one of the main challenges is just living in a situation where you don't know what the future will look like, right? I always tell people when I was in Kakuma refugee camp, I used to wake up with so much hope in the morning. I'd go to school, and then in the evening I'd come back and ask myself, I've never had a chance to see my family again. Will I ever go back to South Sudan? South Sudan is not peaceful yet. Will I ever get an opportunity to go, to higher education? And even if I get a degree, what will that look like, right? I don't have citizenship anywhere else. So honestly, I feel like that torment you in so many ways. It crush your hope, it crush your resilience. It put you in a situation where you don't even know what tomorrow look like. And I think that's one of the main challenges that many people struggle with, especially young people, that daily, situation where you don't know what tomorrow will look like, really crush you, and it crush your inner spirit. I think that is one thing I'll talk about, apart from the other, many other challenges, including, of course, access to very basic necessities and needs. For example, of course, shelter, for example, food, for example, even clean drinking water. These are challenges that many people face on a daily basis, but I think the main thing for me is always that thing that crushes you in spirit.
Wow. Even documentation and movement remains an issue, a daily challenge. Okay.
Issue,
but it's the dream, it's the crushed dream that every day it's like a cycle, it's a loop.
Yeah. Exactly.
You said also, but even with the basics, I think we think of specifically Dadaab and Kakuma as places that have so much funding and all of this. But what are the now basic necessities that are hard to get? What's the system? How do you get food? How do you get clean water? How do you get school? At least you've explained, but yes, food, shelter, water.
So basically, I think in Kakuma refugee camp and also in Dadaab, there are honestly no means for people to become self-reliant, right? You live in a context where even accessing a work permit is very challenging until very recently when Kenya had a new refugee, act that allowed now refugees to apply for work permit. But before that, you couldn't, for example, access a work permit. It's very difficult to access a business permit. So people have no income-generating activities or even any way to sustain themselves. So they only depend mostly on what they get from the UN. So the UN provide monthly food ration that you get every month. They provide, drinking water. They provide healthcare, and that depends on funding. So, for example, out of nowhere, you'll be told, oh, we have no funding for the next few months, so your food ration will be reduced by 50%. And then you're like, what happened, right? And you honestly don't get a lot. You get like, around 5 kgs of wheat flour, for example, for a month for one person. And that cannot really sustain you for the entire month. So people try to find other means, to support themselves. The people who get support from relatives abroad, the people who get support, from people back home in places where things are a bit settled, and someone can try to find something to support you. But you basically depend on what you get from the UN, the humanitarian aid and handout. And that is very dependent on funding. As you can see right now, there's a very big, funding crisis. Many, wealthy countries are, pulling back, their foreign aid, and that means, smaller countries like Kenya have nowhere to support, refugees that they're ours. And honestly, I feel like, I've traveled a lot around the world. I think there's honestly not a lot of credit given to country like Kenya that are struggling with their own economic issues, with their own challenges, who have opened their doors to refugees for so long. Kenya has hosted refugees now for about 3 decades, right? They host more refugees than many wealthy countries. And I think when you talk about solidarity, that means countries that have so much money, that have so much wealth, should support countries like Kenya that have opened their doors to refugees, so that Kenya would be able to give refugees an opportunity not just to survive, but also to thrive.
This comes... Kenya has at one point hosted more than 1 million people in refugees camps, right? When they come down to about 600 or so, 600,000 people in camps. Now, these are people who are living, and like you said, Nhial, you don't have an form of economic income unless those ones were just running shops and such businesses around there, and they also have to be supported, and so on and so forth. But then there's a neighboring community that is also marginalized. Because let's not forget that where these camps are, they are in areas which are marginalized. What was the interaction with the host community? Like, did you ever interact with people outside of the Kakuma itself is huge, right? But then that the neighboring communities, the Turkana and all, they are here. Did you ever interact with them?
All the time. Most of my friends are from the host community. We were like, I always tell people, when you go to both Kakuma and Dadaab, you will go to the refugee camp, you'll go to the host community, you'll see the challenges that people face are very similar. As you just mentioned, those communities are very marginalized. And I think that, in a way, creates some sense of, community. People come together to try to find, solution to the challenges they face. For example, this school I went to was a Kami school, and they have a quota that allow kids from the host community to come in. So there are many kids from host community that, come to Kakuma refugee camp, to go to school there. There are kids that come there to access, their family that come there to access healthcare. There are many families from the host community that come to the camp to try to find, small things they can do, either, small informal job, at the local market in the camp. So I would say, there's a great sense of community, between the host community and the refugees. And I think one thing that brings them together is those challenges, that they try to find ways to survive together.
So right now I'm heading here with this is, so there's a community within the camp that is supported both nationally and internationally. So the people within the camp will have a meal, right? Supported. They'll have access to healthcare, supported. They'll have access to education, supported. And then the host communities don't have these things like, on a guarantee. They don't have guaranteed for food. They don't have guarantees for education. That's some of them have to come, and it's a quota. It's a quota, can access this school. There will be some sense of hostility from the host communities, right? Even globally. How do you deal with that? And not you now as refugees, but now at this point where you're talking about advocacy, how do you deal with host communities and refugee communities and their relationship?
No, definitely. It's important to mention that there have been tension between refugees and us community in Kakuma refugee camp. Even when I was living there as a kid, in 2016, the United Nations, signed the Global Compact on Refugees, and one of the main aspects of it is burden sharing, but also supporting both refugees and the host community. In Kenya now, there's Shirika plan that was signed recently. The Shirika plan basically look at economic integration. And when you look at economic integration, that means provided impact structure that support both refugees and the host community. So, I think that is very critical because, the challenges that refugees face in many, contexts that they live in, are very similar challenges that the host community that face. So I think ensuring that there are tools that allow both refugees and host community, to thrive hands in hand, I think that is very important. And I think that's why, that aspect of, supporting both refugees and host community, I think is important. And I've, traveled across Kenya. I've been to, for example, Kibra. I have so many friends there. I've been to Mathare Islam. You see challenges that are very similar to the challenges I grew up in Kakuma refugee camp. So honestly, I don't think it's just a refugee issue. I think this just need to invest in communities across the country that are facing, this type of marginalization, and that include refugees.
I wanted to ask a little bit about your family, because your dad stayed back. Have you made any efforts to try and get back in touch with your mother, with your siblings, with your dad? Do you know where they are? Do you know if, they managed to leave? All of that.
Yes, so I was able to get in touch with my dad and my mom and my younger sibling. I think the first time was in 2014. That was after 4 years in Kakuma refugee camp. And I'm still in touch with them. And luckily, in 2022, my mom and my younger sibling moved here. So they live here now. We're able to reunite in 2022 for the first time.
Here
Kenya.
In Kenya.
Into the camp?
Yeah, they're in the camp, yeah.
Then Kakuma.
Yeah, then Kakuma. We're able to unite, for the first time after, I think it was 11 years. My dad actually still lived back in Ethiopia. He moved back to South Sudan in 2010, and then the country became independent in 2011, and then 2014, South Sudan went back into civil war, and he fled back to Ethiopia.
Okay. Yeah. I'm happy to hear, one, that you were able to reunite with them, but then I also wanted to know, what integration looks like for families, because there in Kakuma, you left Kakuma a while ago. Yeah. So then how do you integrate families? Do they get integrated, especially when you don't arrive at the same time, right? Because you had the neighbors that you came with, but beyond that, you really didn't have family. So is there a system
and
where
above that, where you've come from, you don't have any papers that show.
True, that
you have
related.
any birth certificate that says my mother is so and so, my father is so and so. So when someone comes and says this is my child, everyone accepts.
Right. Yeah. And would there be so somewhere your mom and your sister could just live with you or something, just wondering how that
works. Yeah, it's actually very challenging. They'll say most refugees have their birthday as 1st January because many people arrive in the camp without a form of identification, right? And the UN will then give you a form of identification. They give you, a manifest that then you use to go and apply for a Kenyan refugee ID card. And that becomes your first form of identification. There are, of course, people that are lucky that when they flee, they have maybe their ID card on them. So those people are easy, or a birth certificate or something. But many people, they do not have any form of identification, and they use what they get in the camp as a form of identification. And of course, that could be a challenge in many ways. So I don't know, honestly, how the UN work around that, if there are situations where someone come and say, this is my kid or something. But for many people, their first form of identification is what they get when they get to the refugee camp.
Okay. What about the integration question? If, for example, you wanted to live with your mom and siblings, what is that?
Yes, so there are many organizations, including UNHCR, that have a refugee unification program. For example, many refugees that come from countries like South Sudan or Somalia, when conflict comes, you don't know which direction you're running to. So there are people all across East Africa, in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, for example. So there are many organizations, from Red Cross, that look at family reunification. So that means bringing family together, and that is one way people can come and live together.
Okay. We're coming up to 8:30. In studio, we have Nhial Deng, who is a refugee advocate, ahead of World Refugee Day tomorrow. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about why there seems to be, there's not enough national discourse on the plight of refugees, and talk a little bit more about solidarity, what true solidarity looks like, as well as hopes and aspirations. This is Fixing the Nation, NTV Nation FM, across our digital platforms. We'll be back after this. Paul Minus talking my Pepe. The way Mariam does demos for WhatsApp Nation is better than AI. It's like you're a walking AI too.
Oh my God.
Super AI.
Super AI.
It's just, I just listen to what they're saying.
Listen. Love it.
Thank you, my Pepe.
Bakari Sagna, the situation at refugee camps is getting worse due to lack of financial support from the international community. US President reduced funding in February. He also goes on to say, and maybe Nhial, you can respond to this, because on the one hand, he said the situation is getting worse, there's lack of financial support, then goes on to say, county governments hosting refugees need to do better. They rely on humanitarian agencies to perform their function, but they should also do better. So there is, and I think we've talked a little bit about it, there's dwindling resources. You already said it usually would depend on whether there's funding that during that month. Yeah. But right now, as you observe, is the situation getting worse in terms of dwindling resources, lack of integration, hostility, policing? Paint that picture for us.
Yes, everything is getting worse and worse. I actually remember not so long ago, there was a big protest back in Kakuma refugee camp because people spent so many days without water. The local authorities said the water generator in the camp broke down and there was no access to water, and people had to go and try to find ways to get water. So that, and then again, they got an announcement the other day that, your food will be reduced for the next couple of months because of funding cut. So the situation is just getting, worse and worse. As I said earlier, everything in the camp pretty much depending on funding, including education itself, right? So, there was actually a time where they had to reduce the number of subjects that we could take in high school because of, funding cut. There are times where they would say, oh, we don't have, enough, resources to hire this number of teachers for this subject, so this subject will not be taught next semester. So everything in the camp pretty much depends on funding. So without funding, everything crippled, including the health service, the education services, the food ration that people get, water that people get. So everything, just Spanish. Yeah.
And even on that note, just going back to the theme, solidarity with refugees, you're talking about financing, it's dwindling. Yeah. Let's bring in the national government. Number one, it almost seems like there's just invisible national discourse. We don't really hear much about it on a national level. What are those collaborative efforts with the government of Kenya? Do you sense commitment? Does it yo-yo? Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. How do you then end up engaging with the government of Kenya? And what end of the bargain do they need to be holding up?
Yeah, honestly, I'd say, the engagement of the Kenyan government have improved, a lot on the refugee front in number of years, in recent years. In 2021, they had the new Refugee, Act that they signed, which replaced the previous Refugee Act from 2006. And that Act, had a number of provisions that really improve, so many things, including, movement pass. They made that process very easy for people to get movement pass, to move out of Kakuma, for education or health reason. They made the process of getting a business permit. If you have access to capital and you want to do that, they made that process easier. They also, had a new provision of, a work permit, I think class M for refugees. So if you have qualification, you can apply for that. And there are now a number of refugees that are actually employed nationally in the country through that, work permit process. And also, I feel like there's been a lot of engagement as well. The government has tried to bring in, private, actors in Kenya. I know, Equity Bank has been really involved. They have expanded, their national scholarship program to refugees. They are also trying to find ways to expand, financial services to refugees. I think that is something that is improving. And then, of course, in 2025, we have the Shirika Plan, which I think, it was good to see the president launching it, because I think that showed some sort of commitment, from that high level. So the Shirika Plan was launched by the president, brought together, different actors from across the country. So I think there's sort of an improvement, and I think that is good. I feel like, I was telling my friend that I feel like as the West sort of retreat from, funding, critical humanitarian services, there are many countries that are honestly showing us what solidarity look like, that have opened their doors to refugees that are honestly struggling with their own challenges. Look across Kenya, I have many Kenyan friends that have gone to some of the top universities and they can't even find a job, right? But, the government is trying to find ways to support those that are in refugee camp, through very limited, capacity. So I think that front is improving, I would say so. There are conversation, on how now can we operationalize the Shirika Plan. One of the key aspects is economic and social integration, ensuring that refugees have access to the tool that allow them to thrive. Education, of course, is a big part of that. So expanding a national program for young people to young refugees, expanding access to, financial services to refugees, ensuring access to legal documentation to refugees. Until very recently, actually, you cannot register for a SIM card with your refugee ID card. And that was changed recently. They had a new gazette that allowed our refugees to register, for a SIM card. with your refugee ID card, including M-Pesa. So I think on that front, I would say things are progressing in a way. There's some conversation happening. Of course, it's just the starting point. There's a lot that need to happen, but at least it's good that conversation is happening. We have the Shirika plan, and now looking at how do we operationalize that and make sure it's fully in working. Yeah.
Let me look at this thing. There's an elephant. It's in the room. Yeah. Okay. And it's all about whether the citizens of Kenya look at refugees as brethren or look at refugees as those guys who live there in that camp. And now you're bringing in Shirika Plan and you're talking about all these other things. Whether, if citizens of Kenya understand what Shirika Plan is, they will say yes to it. So first, let's start with what is the Shirika Plan? What does it have? Because it talks about resettlement and integration, integration of refugees and the Kenyan community. What more? What does it say?
Yeah, so basically Shirika Plan, I think the main aspect of it is that sort of, social and economic integration of refugees into Kenya. Look at how can refugees contribute to Kenyan societies, but also how can refugees find a home in Kenya, beyond the refugee context. So basically, for example, they're looking at, turning refugee camp into settlement so people are able to rebuild their life, run businesses. Kakuma refugee camp, according to a research done by IFC, the International Financial Corporation, as a consumption market of, I think, over 50 million USD a year. That's just, so much money circulating around the camp economy. And I think if these, that aspect of, many, for example, Kenyan financial institutions coming into the camp to invest there, I think that will go a long way. It will allow refugees, an opportunity to be able to contribute to the Kenyan economy in so many different ways. It allows, infrastructure that will serve both refugees and the host communities. So that is one aspect of the Shirika Plan, ensuring that there are resources for both, refugees and the community that host them to thrive together. And basically, allowing refugees to find home. I think that is one key aspect as well. There are people, for example, that are able, to leave Kakuma and maybe they want to live in Nairobi, they are able to afford that. Or, maybe they have started big businesses and they want to extend those businesses outside the camp. How can they do that? That's what Shirika Plan look at.
So what you're saying is that with the Shirika Plan, a refugee can now start having access to banking services, can run and operate a business, and they'll apply for a business permit and get a business permit to run a business, can get out of this confined area called a refugee camp and move out, and they can do all those things. They can even live and own and run a home outside of the refugee camp. Are Kenyans ready?
And maybe that's why I say we don't have enough national discourse. Maybe anecdotally, there's a mix. Obviously, there's some hostility on one hand, but who knows? Maybe there is a section that I don't know that we talk about that enough with Kenyans. I think there's assumptions and then what you hear, banter.
Don't know.
We don't know.
I genuinely don't know. I would love to speak to the communities around Kakuma, Dadaab, any communities that host refugees around the country, and then the country as a whole, and just figure out what the feeling is towards that. But I genuinely don't think with civic education and understanding what the plight of refugees is, why we're doing this, what it looks like, I don't think a lot of fair-minded Kenyans would be opposed to such a thing. It also brings back to a question I wanted to ask Nhial about the weaponization, because this is moving towards sustainability and self-reliance for refugees. So do you ever feel like your plight has been weaponized for funding? Commercialized for funding, whether it's by government, by non-governmentals.
No, definitely there's that bit of that, Having had opportunity to travel around the world, sometimes I'd go, to the UN headquarters in New York. I'd sit down listening to big UN people talking about Kakuma, and I'd say, that's not the Kakuma I grew up in, the way you're describing it.
What did you hear versus what was on the ground?
They honestly talk about Kakuma from, this point of funding. All they want to do is attract funding. And the way they describe Kakuma is this, vulnerable, very marginalized, very hopeless people that if you don't give them funding tomorrow, they'll die. That's not Kakuma, right? So of course, that aspect, I always tell people, if you want to know about refugees, don't quote what politicians say. Don't pick a newspaper. Just go talk to your neighbor who is a refugee, right? There's a lot you can learn.
There's a lot in Nairobi, across the country.
Yeah, so, of course, there's that commercialization of refugees situations for different humanitarian organizations to attract funding. And honestly, I think there's need for more investment in local solutions. For example, now there are many refugee-led organizations, that are operating within refugee camp that work very closely, with the host community, counterparts. I think there's need to move from, these big international organizations that are honestly tell people sometimes have turned into businesses to invest in local solutions. What can a small organization do in Kenya? There's this organization that I'm always very impressed with called Okado, which is started by the host community, by a number of Turkana people in Kakuma. And it's now one of, the biggest emerging, local organization in the refugee context in Kakuma. And it understands the local context well, the people who come from there, the people who have lived in Kakuma, some of them went to the school in the camp. So I think there's need to move from this big international organization more toward local organizations that really understand the local context.
And to individualize it, The three of us have grown up, have gone to school, have started working. We do not talk about, we are not attached to some organization, some benefactor, so on and so forth. Nhial, you have grown up in Kenya. The only home that you can think about is Kenya. You went to a school in Kenya. You speak and you are well exposed, having studied in Kenya. There should be nothing that bars you from coming back here and applying to work at the NTV, Nation Media Group, and getting to work as a Kenyan. Somebody who has gone through our education system, somebody who has lived in this country. But then, we don't see it that way.
No.
Even we in Kenya, we treat it like, okay, so those are refugees, do they have IDs? No. Should they vote? Why should Nhial not vote? Why should Nhial not vote for the next governor of Turkana? Why should he not vote for the next president of Kenya? Why should he not?
Remember, it's an intentional global narrative to spin things. You know what I mean? It's supposed to be that way. You're not supposed to think too much about. You're supposed to ask the questions. There's a reason why these things happen. It benefits some people. It turns into a business to keep Nhial as the vulnerable refugee. But if that was taken away, an agency was created, then we would be able to say, oh, I've gotten to know Nhial. We're the same. We grew up the same. The difference is he came here because he had to. But we read in the same area, went to school, we're friends now. He should be able to vote. But this narrative can't be spun that way. Too many people won't benefit. There's a caller, Michael from Kericho, who wants to ask a question. Michael, good morning. Please go ahead.
Okay, it's not really a question, more of a comment.
Okay.
What I noticed from, the war in Congo has been going on for long, so probably five years or more. So the Congolese, they come to Kenya, someone brings them in. I saw someone bring in 50 Congolese and then put them in a dormitory, so they don't pay rent and they get free food. And then they're given a 5-liter flask with mandazi or kangumu. Alafu wanatembeza. Wakitembeza, each of them makes 1,500 per day. And then they give the person who brought them 1,000 shillings per day. They end up making only 500. And then that person also takes 200 out of the 500. So at the end of the day, they only take 300. The 200 they take for savings. So that when they want to go back to their country, they could have accumulated something. Now my question is it safe for people to do that to a fellow human being, like making 1,000 shillings, no, 1,200 shillings per day from someone? This is like modern day slavery.
It is. Thanks, Michael. You're very right in the sense that, and this is not the only case we've heard of the plight of refugees being weaponized against them being it's trafficking, exploitation and trafficking. A lot of Ethiopian refugees as well, and it's kind of like you have this sponsor who brings you in, and now you work off your debt. It's modern day slavery for sure. How does it happen exactly? Because you would think we have these structures, right, that allow for refugees to come, even if it is within the camp, and to live a dignified, protected life, right?
There are, of course, many challenges that refugees face along those lines. I think one of the main things is you come to a country where you don't have any form of identification. You don't have any, you don't even know who to turn to if you are, in a situation like that. So I think this a need to really, improve access to legal services for refugees in Kenya. You know, I know there's a few organizations that work along those lines on advocating for or trying to ensure refugees can get legal access, especially in situations like that where you don't even know who to turn to, right? You don't know if you should approach the police. They might ask you for an ID. You don't have one. What will you do? Yeah. So I think that is honestly a very, very big challenge, that aspect of, refugees not having access to legal services. Even when you find yourself in a situation like with the police, maybe they arrest you, you have to know who to call. You don't have a lawyer, you don't even know you'll get access to a lawyer, So I think this need to really improve that, so that refugees, can know who to turn to in a situation like that. And it's very, very challenging, and I can, attest with people who go through things like that.
Right. It makes it easier now to be taken advantage of. Yeah. But who do you report to, for example? You flee your country for one reason or the other. Yeah. How do I get into the system so that I get the first statement, the thing you said before you get the ID, before the refugee ID, there's something else that you're given.
Yeah, so before the refugee ID, you go to basically the UNHCR. So the UNHCR now work very close with the Kenyan government on registration. So you go to one of their field offices, and actually now it's good that, they don't just have offices in the camp, but they have field offices across, the country, including in places like Eldoret, Nakuru, here in Nairobi, in Mombasa, where you can go and, you're able to get registered, and then you can get access to a refugee ID card, and then the refugee ID card, then allow you to be able to access a number of services in the country.
So if there's a refugee listening right now who has come in, hasn't registered formally anywhere, either has been brought in by someone or they fled and found their way here, you would tell them to go to the nearest UNHCR office?
Yeah, I would encourage them to go to the nearest either UNHCR office or the nearest Department of Refugee Services office. So the Department of Refugee Services is under the Ministry of Interior and National Government, and that manage refugee operation in the country, working very closely with UNHCR. So either of them can assist you. And also you can also go to UNHCR. They have a help page on their website, UNHCR Kenyan page, and that help page will allow you, or will give you access to what information on your specific situation, if it's registration, if it's documentation, or whatever you need.
And many may come probably no documentation at all, right? Some, all right. So how does UNHCR or the organizations then begin to trace or paint a picture of who Nhial is? He's come, I don't know him, he only knows his name, there's no ID. Do they just put you in a database and then begin to build your identification?
So they basically, work with you and try to trace where you come from or who you are. It's a very challenging situation. I remember, I actually, after I finished high school, one of my first job in the camp was working as an interpreter at the Department of Refugee Service registration desk. And just registering one family would take so long because they have to go through a sort of an interview process to try to determine what their identity are and who they are. So this sort of, the UN and the Kenyan government has worked closely together. They came up with a benchmark that is used around the world on a process called refugee status determination. So working to determine your status as a refugee, why did you fled, what are the reasons. So they are basically a framework that they use, and that framework then help them capture your identity and give you a piece of ID.
Yeah, I realized you asked Mariam, and then I decided to conspiracy theory by be like, there's a reason why that narrative is spun. But what do you think?
There could be reasons that narratives are spun, and that's where you find institutions, organizations dealing with refugees. I'm at a point of community, because we are heading closer and closer towards the integration of refugees. And I'm pushing this narrative so that by the time we are increasing this conversation, we already are thinking around it. We are going to see Kakuma and Dadaab becoming, integrated settlements. We are going to start seeing people from there wanting to come and integrate to that in the communities. How much information and knowledge do we have? We're hospitable enough, but now when we start saying, okay, so they're moving in, how prepared are we?
Shifting from having a guest in your home to sharing your home with someone.
That's it. We have a call on the line.
Yes. Marcella, is that who? Marcella from Gong. Good morning, Marcella. Do you have a question or comment?
No, I have a comment.
Okay.
And so for mine, I would kind of base it on biblical perspective, that for so long we've been asked by God to treat refugees as our own, okay, as citizens, and love them. And I believe that in Kenya we have enough that we can be able to integrate the refugees into our society. considering that some of these children are born into the camp. So they also have the right to education, they have the right to proper medication and everything. And so I believe just giving them that refugee card is not enough. All right? So I believe we have, as counties, we have the capabilities of being able to integrate the refugees properly. And also on the issue of weapons, I think that one is a bit tricky, but if the borders are well, if the borders are very well guarded, then I believe the issue of weapon can be dealt with. But I believe refugees have the right, especially those who have been in Kenya for 10 years, 15 years, 18 years. Then they are Kenyans, I believe that. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Marcella. Yeah, speaking to the spirit of community, the nature of who we are. I think our default setting is humanity, empathy, extending. Character development comes in, you're co-opted, you're disrupted, and suddenly there's a hostility. But to Marcella's point, whether it's based on faith or who we are, I think there's that sense of camaraderie.
Inherently, you want to welcome somebody to your home. Inherently, you want to, accommodate them and acknowledge them. Inherently, do we draw a line? I have to keep pushing that. Because inherently, do we draw a line?
We do.
We do.
It's
human nature.
Accommodating if it comes at no cost to us or no discomfort. I mean cost literally and figuratively, because the government has weaponized it. It's like, if we don't get this much, tunafunga camp, right? That's very true. And also the cost of figuratively from an emotional perspective.
And I think, just to jump in quickly, I think that is why one of the main aspects of the global compact of refugees is burden sharing. Countries like Kenya that house over 100,000 refugees should have the support and the tools and the resources, to be able to make that, operational, to make sure that refugees, can actually, economical and social integrate into Kenyan societies, be it, I think one of the prohibition, for example, in the Shirika plan is basically looking at refugees that come from the East Africa community, to have, access to, let's say, or a pathway that allow them, to either become, national citizen of Kenya, or, that allow them to access, some sort of, a formal immigration status. And I'll tell people, in Kenya, there are many different immigrants. It's not just refugees, right? There are people that are moved from across the world. Let's say someone moved to Kenya because they have work permit and they want to work here, or they get a job here. So refugees just, one category of immigrants that live in Kenya, right? So they basically, those, there's that aspect of burden sharing, ensuring that Kenyan have the tools. As I mentioned earlier, I think Kenya is a country that have its own challenges. So you cannot just wake up today and say, oh, refugees go wherever you want to go, right? That will be chaos everywhere, right? For everyone, including both refugees and the us. But, if you have a very well planned out mechanism that said, these are ways you can be able to get, access to these services in Kenya. Even, if people want to move out of Kakuma, there's also a process. There are now, this number of people that are called urban refugees. Of course, I think over 80% of refugees in Kenya live in camps. And there are urban refugees that live in urban centers. People that have the means to maybe move to Nairobi and rent a place and, be able, to support themselves here. Maybe either by starting a business, they have a business permit because maybe they have access to capital from either, financial institutions or from a relative abroad or back home. So those two, I think one of the main aspects is, can refugees, be able to support themselves? And if they can't support themselves, what more support do we need to give them? Can we give them access to work permit if someone has, a degree from the University of Nairobi and they maybe get a job, as a nurse at a Kenyan, hospital? Can we give them the tools so that they can get that job and be able to work and contribute to the Kenyan society, but also support themselves as well?
Yes. So we have to wrap up. Just as we're going, children born of refugees in Kenya, on Kenyan soil, are they Kenyan citizens?
No. Kenyan, don't have, what is it called? The birthright citizenship?
They've been born of Kenyan parents.
Maybe it was my misunderstanding. I don't know. In social studies, I thought we were taught kuna kitu kama citizenship by birth.
I think one of the parents have to be a Kenyan citizen.
Kenyan parent.
Yeah, Kenyan
That's
parents.
not by being born on Kenyan soil.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Nhial, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much
and
for having
keep
me.
doing what you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Keep studying. You're studying in Canada now. Keep doing that. Come back home.
Yeah, I'll have to.
This is
take
home, right? and help us push this.
Yeah.
It's a big thing, by the way. Familiarize yourself with the Shirika plan. It's a very, very big plan. If it was implemented well, then people's rights, and these are the people who have lived in these camps for so long, will then also be realized. Our next conversation talks about Kenyans living abroad, the diaspora. Do they have their rights? Are they enjoying their rights? We'll be speaking to one of them. Keep it here for that. It's 9 a.m.